Hello and welcome to the large group panel on reopening with equity in learning for all. And if we would go to the slides, and the next slide is the disclaimer that tells us that the contents of this presentation were developed by the presenters for this conference, but these contents do not necessarily represent the policy of the department, and you should not assume any endorsement from the federal government. On the next slide, we have the agenda. So you're going to hear, I'm going to start with just providing a little bit of an equity frame, and then we'll hear from the presenters on using MTSS, or the multi-tiered systems of support, to envision how to address inequity, how to personalize, differentiate, and individualize for equity, assessment strategies and family engagement among diverse populations, supporting students from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds within MTSS, and then we'll have a couple of minutes for some questions at the end. On the next slide, we'll get started with looking at the equity frame. So looking at the title of this session, which again is Reopening with Equity for Learning, in Learning for All. So let's think about reopening. And these quotes come from the executive orders. And reopening is all about health and safety for children, students, educators, families, and communities. And putting that as the paramount, as the top priority, it truly focuses on that each child is unique and each community is unique. So what is learning? It seems like a simple question, but it's, I think, very important to think about learning in this context is about high quality education. And we're going to hear today from our panelists some strategies on how to provide high quality education as we're coming back from the pandemic. The next slide, we have a long quote from another executive order that defines what equity is. And equity is consistent and systematic, fair, just, and impartial treatment of all individuals. And then looking at specifically this definition pulls out a couple of specific populations that have experienced maybe adversely affected by inequality and inequity. So looking at racial or ethnic diversity, looking at religious minorities or LGBTQ plus persons, individuals with disabilities, those who are living in rural areas, and others maybe in poverty have really been affected by inequality. And we've heard this, that these populations have been very significantly and adversely impacted by the pandemic more than the average. And so when we think about equity in reopening schools, we really could easily get overwhelmed by how can we possibly do this. And luckily, we've got a good panel today who are going to be able to share some, I think, very insightful ideas of how to do that. Before I introduce those, I want to remind us of what we just heard, if you were in the plenary this morning, from our Deputy Secretary of Education, Cindy Martin, who said that equity is when students get what they need when they need it. And so thinking about that as our definition of equity going forward, we're really going to be able to hear today some strategies and approaches that are going to be able to bring that equity to students with disabilities as they begin this 2021 to 2022 school year. So on the next slide, you will see the names of our presenters. Sasha Heavey is an inclusive practices teacher with Boston Public Schools, and she holds 3 teacher licensures in the state of Massachusetts. One's in early childhood, one moderate disabilities, and then one for English learners. So you're going to be able to hear somebody who has quite a depth of expertise about teacher and inclusive practices. Next, Terry Marks is the Intensive Technical Assistance Lead of the Progress Center. She provides TA and professional development on intensive interventions, delivering specially designed instruction and effective teaming and systematic changes in support of students with disabilities. Lusa Lowe is an associate professor from the University of Massachusetts at Boston. Her research focuses on family, school, community partnerships, and educational planning and practices for language minority students with disabilities. And Robai Warunga is an assistant professor of special education in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction in the College of Education at the University of Massachusetts, Lowell. Her research focuses on academic and behavioral interventions through MTSS, especially looking at emotional behavioral disabilities and learning disabilities within the focus of culturally and linguistic diverse learners. As I said, our panel is really prepared to share their deep expertise today, and they will each present in turn, and then we will open up for some questions. So to begin with, here's Sasha Heavey.
Hi, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here and talk about the upcoming school year. This year will be the 3rd year that has been incredibly impacted by the pandemic and school closures in many ways. So if we can go to the next slide. And the next one after that. Great. When the pandemic first shut down schools, many of us thought it would not have a lasting effect on us. Me and my colleagues discussed how we would be back to school on Monday. Then it stretched to a few weeks, then the remainder of the school year. When that happened, we focused on making sure families were healthy within their homes. We were not holding classes like we did during the 2021 school year. Many families in my school and my district are underserved and at risk. Because of this, we knew we as a school needed to establish our priorities right away. Mental health and safety were at the top of the list. We also needed to make sure that students had access to technology and the internet in order to participate in online learning. We were doing home visits daily, dropping off food, computers, iPad, clothing, you name it, we dropped it. One of my favorite days was sitting outside of one of my students' houses, talking through her window while on the phone with her, trying to help her and her family connect her Chromebook to the internet. I really realized I missed them just as much as they missed school, if not more. Anyways, as we ended the school year and started the next, we were hopeful. We knew that teaching and learning needed to be moved to the top of the priority list. It's not like teaching and learning didn't happen before, but due to our population, there were other items on the priority list. Last year, we wanted to make sure that our students and families' basic needs were being met. They had access to not only technology and the internet, but school supplies as well. We wanted to ensure the best we possibly could that each student had what they needed to have a successful school year. That was different for each child. Many students could pick up school supplies that the teacher handpicked for them. However, many supply kits needed to be dropped off. I had few students that had difficulty with executive functioning skills, so I was ending up sending them little bits sporadically through the mail. Unfortunately, things like this didn't happen with every student, with every class, with every school, or with every district. The level of individual attention and dedication each student needs and will continue to need due to the pandemic is immense. We need to keep that in mind, and that all of these best practices that teachers and administrators have learned during the pandemic will be useful in the upcoming year. With all that thoughtful preparation for the school year, unfortunately, there were still many inequalities with online learning. We were at risk of having these inequalities follow us into the next school year, so it's important to call them out. Teacher knowledge was a barrier during the pandemic. Knowledge of technology, family dynamics and condition, and contact knowledge being taught online. Being able to assess students to inform us where the gaps were, to know where to start on the curriculum scope and sequence was a mission. Layer on the diverse needs of students with special needs, language needs, and behavioral needs as well. We truly wanted to make academics a focus while being mindful of our families' situations. The honest truth is that there was a decrease in learning time during the last school year for a number of reasons. Obviously, technology was one of them, and computer literacy. Having young students log on to multiple different links to attend the classes and receive the specialized instruction that they needed was challenging. And depending on the content alone was a barrier. For example, occupational therapy, when many different manipulatives were needed, such as speech therapy, hands-on science, etc. Time was also taken away from learning due to lack of engagement and motivation. It was all too easy for students to disengage while online. Many students were home alone because their parents were working. Young students had difficulties sticking to a schedule with no direct adult supervision. Many older students would miss morning classes because they were so tired from themselves working the night before, or because their home life responsibilities had increased. These circumstances did not happen throughout every population, and this is where the uneven impact lies. Listening to myself talk, it sounds a little bit like doom and gloom, but honestly, it wasn't. There were so many positive takeaways from the past year and a half that I'm excited to bring into the next school year. That being said, I reviewed all of this because it's important to remember what has happened in the past. It's important to recognize that many families, students, teachers, administrators have all experienced trauma due to this pandemic. It is ongoing, and it's going to be hard for some people to come back to in September, but many of us and most of us are elated. But that doesn't mean there won't be an adjustment. Next slide. When we think about the upcoming school year, teachers, parents, and administrators are concerned about our students' educational gaps and behavioral needs, both of which are equally as important. In my school, we have been using RTI, Response to Intervention, in PBIS, Positive Behavioral Intervention System, for around 10 years or so. These two things together are essentially MTSS, or the multi-tiered system of support, which is the framework of interventions used to help students with both academics and behavioral challenges. I am by no means an expert, but I have been tiering students based on their needs and dedicating my time to making sure that students are getting what they need with the right intensity and consistency for quite some time. When we think about the implementation of MTSS, I want to note how important it is to staff schools appropriately. At GPA, all staff are cross-licensed to ensure our students are being taught by teachers who have experience in teaching general education, English learners, and students with disabilities. Because of this, we can be very strategic when we form groups for intervention work. Students can be grouped cross-classroom and even cross-grade level. Due to school closures and the trauma of this pandemic, there is truly no time to waste this year. We need to grab students and give them something different from day one. Schools and teachers need to have universal screeners and time to sit with colleagues and families to discuss the needs of each individual student. Teachers need to be well-versed in a multitude of different interventions that can be provided to students in response to their levels of need. And let's keep in mind that this isn't just a one-off that happens at the beginning of the year. Teachers need to be given time to give the universal screener, analyze data, talk with colleagues, make group, plan, and essentially do it all over again later in the year. Teachers are going to need to track the progress of their students regularly and see if students' individual plans need to be tweaked. Parental involvement is also a key portion of MTSS. I honestly think this year, more than ever before, schools need to be collaborating with families. There is a fine line between bombarding families with meetings and reports and truly incorporating them into the education of their child. Families need to be heard and included. We need to be open to hearing what the pandemic was like for each family and what the impact has been on their students. There will be a lot of emotional and educational hurdles this upcoming school year and years to come, We need to have families as allies when it comes to their child's education. What I just described is a lot of work, essentially for schools that have not been used to doing this type of tiered interventions. Administrators need to be actively involved. They will need to guide us and offer us teachers lots of support. At my school each year in the fall and in the spring, we have what is called a whole class review. During the whole class review, teachers, principals, paras, the school psychologists, even interns are present to discuss each child on a behavioral and their behavioral and educational concerns and successes, which is really important. During this meeting, we try to give a thorough snapshot of each child and then discuss what supports each child is already provided with. And then we move on to what supports we think as a team needs to be added. This is key because there are so many outside partners that can support students that we as teachers just are not aware of. So it is such an amazing opportunity to talk with teams to advocate for each student individually. After the whole class review, the school psychologist will then present any concerns to our child guidance team for additional ideas and then circle back to us. Next slide. That being said, what are we teaching the students? There has been so much talk about if we should go back and teach or reteach skills and previous content from the grade prior, or should we move forward with our current skills and content? And I think it needs to be a little bit of both. There's something to be said about balance. This school year is a major year for our students. We need to consider the whole child more than ever. Many children will have regressed both socially, emotionally, and academically. Creating a vision for the year can help administrators and teachers to maintain the same student-centered goals throughout. This vision needs to be constantly referred back to and even tweaked and further developed as the year goes on. This vision should include academics, family, health, mental health, and diverse populations such as English language learners and students with special needs. Because I am a special education teacher, my mind is always thinking with that lens. I am used to reading individual education plans to get to know my students before I even meet them, to gain information about how they learn best, what their strengths are and what their weaknesses are, and what their interests are. It's exciting to look at the curriculum and standards and develop a plan of action based on their IEP and what entry points each child has that can help them access the knowledge that they need. And although not every child has a IEP or needs one, I do think this year each student is going to need much more individualized attention than ever before. Many students, other than students with individual plans, are going to need to be taught on their instructional level, moving towards grade level content, meaning that students need to still be exposed to grade level content, but it may need to be modified so they can access it. You see this a lot in science or social studies. Students who are fully capable of understanding and learning the content, but are not yet proficient readers. So the level of reading has changed, but the content remains the same. Again, this is not easy work, and teachers need to be supported and given time to plan and collaborate on lessons. Because so many students missed key concepts last year, and even the end of the year before that, there needs to be a balance this year when we think about the curriculum and standards that are going to be taught. Although all standards are important within each grade level, there needs to be certain power standards that are identified that are focused on. Basically, what do students need to know by the end of the year? Teachers need to look at the previous grade levels power standards and their current standards and identify major connecting topics between grades that can hit on both. This too will require teachers to have an excellent command over the content and having the ability to collaborate with teachers in other grades. And ideally, some of this work will happen before school even begins in September. School climate should be included in the vision for the school year and is also a part of MTSS. When we welcome all students back full-time in September, our schools need to feel as positive and welcoming as possible. Positive school climate can be an essential factor in students accessing and being successful this year. Students deserve a school where teachers take time and pride in developing relationships with each of them and their families. A school where they know they will receive and continue to receive the help they need if and when they are struggling in any way. One that values mistakes and fosters students to learn and teach others. At my school, we have an entire team dedicated to school climate and PBIS. The focus of this school climate this year is safety and happiness. Our top priority is to welcome all of our students back to school where they feel safe and loved. It's important that we reach out to the students and families that never returned to school last year and support their transition back. We are planning in-school events that will build community within their classrooms and across the school. These events will be fun. After all, learning is supposed to be fun, and that's why I love my job so much. We also need to make an effort to include families in this work. We need to have their voices heard and have them included as much as possible. I'm not sure if families will be able to be physically present within school this year, but one great outcome of this pandemic is that we have come away with so many best practices that allow families to be involved even when apart. Lastly, I want to point out that our most valuable students require investments this year. I know extra funding is being given to address the pandemic's disruptions to teaching and learning, and it's a great thing. Teachers and administrators need to backwards plan by developing a vision, identifying what steps need to happen to create that vision. This will mostly include evaluating gaps and identifying the basic needs within the classroom, which will then lead to creating new positions and possibly even new teams to address these gaps. Thank you for your time.
Hi, everyone. I just want to say thank you to Sasha. That was so helpful in helping to frame our conversation today. I really loved what you mentioned about safety and happiness kind of being the essential components that you wanted to focus on this year, this upcoming school year. I really believe that that is critical. So if we could go ahead and start our slide deck, I'll go ahead and start with the presentation. You can move on to the next slide here, and I'll kind of frame who I am and where I'm from. So for those that are familiar with the OSEP Technical Assistance and Dissemination Centers, you may or may not know about the Progress Center. It's a newer funded center from OSEP. And so I am here representing the Progress Center today. And the Progress Center is a center that is funded to provide information, resources, tools, and technical assistance to support local educators in developing and implementing high quality educational programming that enable children with disabilities to progress and meet those challenging outcomes. All right, so actually, if you can go back to that slide. All right, perfect. So what we do is we really connect current research and policy with what's happening in the field, and we have some partner sites that we are going to be selecting this summer and announce those soon, and those will be our partners in this work. We want our center to be focused on what's actually happening out in the field. So, you know, really kind of digging into what's going on and making sure that we are on the front lines with those that are out in schools today. But we also want to share those key messages with everybody out in the field as well, and make sure that we are doing our due diligence to disseminate the most valuable information that's going to support educators in the field, administrators in the field, to really implementing that mission and vision that we have as a center to development and implementation of high quality programs for students with disabilities, no matter the setting that they're in. So we work across public, private, and charter schools, and across urban, rural, and suburban areas. And so we have a really good pulse on what's going on, but we can always learn more. And that's really the purpose of our center. All right, let's move forward. Okay, so I'm not sure everybody, if you're familiar with Simon Sinek. If you are, you know about his work to start with why. And that's what I want us to do today, is to really start with why. Start with our understanding about why the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act was funded in the first place, and really kind of reflect on some of that, that key importance around the purpose of IDEA as we move forward today. And so if you think about starting with why, one of the things that I wanted to share is this quote that comes from 2004 IDEA. That was the last time that the IDEA was updated or reauthorized. And I'm just going to read this. And I want you, as I'm reading this, to be really reflective and really thinking about that key purpose that we have as special educators, as administrators, as state leaders, as parents and families, to ensure that our students and our children have success. So here's this quote: "Disability is a natural part of the human experience and in no way diminishes the right of individuals to participate in or contribute to society. Improving educational results for our children with disabilities is an essential element of our national policy of ensuring equality of opportunity, full participation, independent living, and economic self-sufficiency for individuals with disabilities." If that isn't the heart of equity, if that isn't the heart of what we are doing in special education and how we're designing our programs for our learners with specific individualized needs, we need to stop, reflect, and really go back to starting with why. So if we move on to the next slide, what we also see in the IDEA is this definition of special education. And I'm sure because this audience is very familiar, you're very savvy, you know this definition. You should know this definition in and out. But we're just going to take a second to really think about it again. So special education, as defined, is specially designed instruction at no cost to the parents or families to meet the unique needs of a child with disability. So there's a couple aspects within that definition that I really want to highlight. One being unique needs, and the second being that it's to meet the unique needs of that child with a disability. But if you continue to read, it's to meet those educational standards that apply to all children. And so what we need to be thinking about as we're thinking about designing services is that those are services that we're putting in place to address the unique needs. And the services should have this key outcome focus on making sure that those students that have these disabilities that are impacting either their access to or involvement or progress in the curriculum or the educational setting in general, that we are making sure that those educational standards apply to them as well. And so I think that also helps to frame that conversation. We need to be thinking about the unique needs of our learners as we are really designing and, again, implementing high quality programs for our students. So if we move on to the next slide, you're going to see our Progress Center, what we call our success formula. And our success formula starts with that development of high quality educational programming for students with disabilities. Keep back one. Thank you. Okay. And implementation is the second part of that formula. So the implementation of that high quality educational program for students with disabilities. What you'll notice in the success formula is that there is a multiplication sign. That is intentional. Okay. So if we think about our mathematics equations, if we think about how multiplication works, if we put a 0, if we do not have a high quality developed program in place for a student, even if we implement it, right, we can implement something that isn't high quality, then we're not going to see those improved access and outcomes. If we have that implementation piece in place, right, but the developed program that we've actually constructed for a child isn't high quality. So that's kind of the reverse there, where we really haven't put together this plan and this program for this child, for our student that is individualized and unique for them, and we implement it, we're likely not to see those improved access and outcomes. And so we want to make sure that we're thinking about the success formula as we are moving forward in developing and implementing, especially in the coming year, really thinking about how do we do that. And if we can go ahead and move on to the next slide. And I apologize, I must have submitted some slides that had some automatic moving forward in them. I'm hoping that that's not the case anymore. So hopefully no more tech glitches, but I really do appreciate everybody sticking with. All right. So if you are in special education and have not heard of the Andrew F. versus Douglas County School District U.S. Supreme Court decision, we're going to talk about that briefly now. And what we want to kind of highlight are a couple things within this Andrew decision. So this was a 2017 U.S. Supreme Court. It's only the second U.S. Supreme Court that's really dealt with the issue around free, appropriate public education for learners with disabilities. And what what we see in this decision is that the courts said that reasonably calculated that an IEP, okay, so that's the precursor to the 3 dots, our ellipsis there. The individualized education program for a child must be reasonably calculated to enable a child to make progress appropriate in light of the child's circumstances. Now, I don't just emphasize that word progress because I work at the Progress Center, but really because I think that what this decision did is really help us frame how we need to be thinking about our services that we're providing to students. They need to ensure progress. It's not that we're just putting a program in place, but that program actually results in meaningful benefit. And it's the opinion of the court in those next 3 bullets. So it's the IEP is constructed only after careful consideration of the child's present levels of of achievement, disability, and potential for growth. The educational program must be appropriately ambitious for the child. And the key here at this last bullet, the standard is more demanding than the merely more than de minimis test applied by the 10th Circuit. So if any of you are familiar with kind of these legislative pieces, you'll know that the de minimis language is the bare minimum that we can be providing. And so what Andrew did was help us to think about, we need to be really thinking about whether or not we're just providing bare minimum to students, but really ensuring that as we're developing and implementing programs for our learners, that it is leading to progress, again, appropriate in light of the child's circumstances. So that goes back to that purpose of IDEA, that definition of special education, that it has to be meeting the unique needs. All right, if we move on to the next slide. So when we think about free appropriate public education and how it's defined within the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, there's kind of 3 different pieces that we like to think about on the Progress Center to help frame understanding around this. So the first is what we call the procedural requirements. And that's when we're actually constructing our individualized education program. So much like if we had all of the parts of a bike. So you'll see that kind of image of the bike, right? There's wheels, there's handlebars, there's the frame, there's pedals, there's everything that we need to be doing, or we have all of the pieces. And that's really what we're thinking about in terms of the procedural requirements. We have all of the pieces in place, right? We have present level statements. We have specially designed instruction articulated in the IEP. We have a monitoring plan or a way that we're going to be doing that. We've checked all of our boxes. We've made sure that we've involved parents and families at those meetings. And really the question that's there on the screen comes from the Rowley decision, which is the preceding US Supreme Court decision to Andrew. I mentioned there were 2 in the US Supreme Court, and Rowley was actually enacted in 1982. So and the question that we're going to highlight here is really what the Rowley decision helped us think about. In the development of an IEP, has the team complied with the procedures set forth in the IDEA? So that was really what we were asking about. Do we have the procedures in place? And that's those procedural requirements. What Andrew did was give us this focus on how do we put that bike together? Right? And that's really what we're calling, and under the FAPE requirements, they call the substantive requirements. So this is helping us to ask about, is the IEP reasonably calculated to enable the child to make progress that is appropriate in light of his or her circumstances? So we're not just putting each of these individual pieces off on a shelf. We're actually constructing them together to put that bike on the path. And we'll talk about that path in just a second. So the bike has to be constructed, right? We have to be making sure that all of those pieces are working together. And if we go back to the definition or kind of that decision in Andrew related to its progress in light of the child's circumstances. And so our substantive requirements are really, really reflective of truly designing a program that's going to lead us there. And then what we have to think about too is our requirements to implementation. We can't just put together those or pull together pieces, construct a bike, and then have the bike sit in a garage, much like we shouldn't be constructing an IEP, right? That we have all of the paperwork in order and we have all of the different goals in order, and then we stick it on a shelf. That's not implementation. And so what we encourage teams to think about, and we encourage our sites to think about in these FAPE requirements, is that implementation requirement. So it's actually putting that bike on a path, right? It's actually taking that individualized education program and implementing it. And we need to be asking ourselves, as the slide highlights, in implementing the IEP, were the instructional services and supports outlined in the IEP provided as agreed upon during the IEP process? And so we want to be thinking about, if we have done our due diligence in that development phase, what we're talking about as agreed upon is not just the procedural components, but also the substantive components that are going to enable that child to make progress. So if we have all of that in place and we implement it, and on that path, as we're thinking about that path for implementation, there's the other sorts of systemic features that we need to be thinking about. Sasha mentioned earlier some aspects around teacher knowledge that were struggles during the pandemic. We need to be thinking about, do we have our educators, do they have ample professional development to be able to implement the evidence-based practices that we've identified? Do they have the training in those practices and programs? Do they know what they need to be doing to ensure the monitoring of fidelity? Do they have adequate knowledge of how to really truly drill down and understand what the students' true needs are, and then officially use some progress monitoring, valid and reliable tools to monitor the progress of our students? So all of those things come into play. The other thing that's on that path, and I think is really critical, and you've heard a couple of people talk about this, and I heard this mentioned in both the keynote yesterday as well as some of the messages this morning, was really around this need for involving parents and families, right? So they are a part of this IEP team. They are a part of helping us understand the pieces that we need for that bike, right? They can help us really craft a strength statement. They can really help us think about what are the ways that that bike needs to be constructed best to put it on the path to progress. The other thing that we can think about there within our IEP team is the student, right? We need to be involving our students in these decisions that are impacting their educational experience. Okay, so if we move on to the next slide, what I really want us to think about in terms of moving into this next school year is re-examining our present levels. And I would say that this is something that we should be doing for each individual child. We've heard a lot about, and even David mentioned Cindy's message around equity, that it's every child gets what they need when they need it. Well, if we don't have adequate information within our present level statements about what they need, then we can't deliver an equitable experience for that child. And Cindy also encouraged us to think about equity at the local level. That's that IEP team level. And so really making that connection that we have to really understand the students' needs, understand how we're going to address them to make sure that we are providing that. So what I would encourage us to do is really re-examine present level statements, which are statements of the child's present levels of academic achievement and functional performance, right? And for those that are looking at that, the slide here, you'll see that the Progress Center has a tip sheet related to present levels of academic achievement and functional performance. There are other tip sheets related to both the procedural and substantive components of the IDEA FAPE requirements that we covered. So we encourage you to check out the website promotingprogress.org. But I really wanted to highlight this notion of re-examining present levels. So if we go to the next slide, we're going to see why this is so essentially critical. So one of the things is the present level statement, our PLAF, is really the foundation of the entire individualized education program. What we put into the present level statement should connect directly to the goals, which then we should have a plan for measuring and monitoring progress toward those goals. We should be creating a statement of special education aids and services that again goes back to what we've identified in that present level. We should be articulating participation outside of regular education and in state and district-wide assessments. And then we need to identify the date, frequency, duration, and location of services. Each of those components is what is written into the IDEA as being foundational for an IEP, right? If we hit each of these boxes, then we have a program. But again, that's just getting us to those procedural requirements. Each of those parts are in place. So if we want to think about really how we can raise the quality And we need to think about how we're going to answer that question that we talked about in terms of the Andrew F. decision. We should start with that present level because it's the foundation for the rest of what we're doing in the plan, or the program, I'm sorry, our individualized education program. The other piece that I want to mention here is that direct relationship is something that is articulated, not just through NJU, but it's really critical for us to be thinking about in terms of just our obligations as special educators, I think, and educators and related service providers. We have that obligation to address the unique needs of the individual child. If we go to the next slide, I want to take us back to that purpose. I want to take us back to where we kind of started, and really think about this importance of individualization, right? So you'll see off to the right of the slide that there are images of different bikes. We talked about there have to be the bike parts. We talked about you have to put those parts together to create a bike and then put that bike on a path. What we didn't talk about is that there has to be a bike that matches that student's need, that is individualized for them. So for some learners, we may still have some training wheels that we've put into place. There might be additional supports that are there. I think about even, not pictured here, but, a parent or family member who's teaching their child how to ride a bike, they're right there with them. So that might be some of the supports that an individual kid needs. But hopefully we're gradually releasing and we are building that transference. We're building independence in our children and our students. The other thing is some of our students might need, a bike that's designed for a Tour de France. Maybe they are really excelling in one specific area. Maybe they're a twice exceptional child. And so we need to be thinking about those particular unique needs of that individual kid. Some of our students might still need some training wheels. Some might have, a bike that's more designed for, a different sort of purpose. They might be heading down a path to a different sort of vocational experience. And so their IEP should be really designed, especially if we're thinking about post-secondary transition for students who are a little bit older, with what they envision for their future, what they see as their strengths, and really making sure that we're doing that. So I wanted to kind of think about that importance of individualization. And I'm going to take a little bit of time to just kind of reflect on individualization. And I want you to be thinking about that question that's up on the slide. If we had a plan or a program put in front of us, an IEP put in front of us, and we started off reading it, if we took out that kid's name, could anybody who knows the student identify them just based on reading that present level statement, just based on looking at that individualized education program? If we can't say for certain that we would know who this child is just by reading that statement, we haven't done our due diligence. I say this because I also was reflecting on the other pieces here about the importance of individualization, the importance of what we need to put into our strength or our present level statements, and really highlighting student strengths. I listened to Gabriella, and I'm sure many of you did earlier, and one of the things that I really noted about her presentation was just her sense of humor, right? She kind of said off the cuff a little bit, she got blessed by a monk in Greece, but she still couldn't walk. That humor, that kind of independence that she brought is something that we should be kind of identifying within our programs. We also need to trust them, as she said, trust our students that they know best what their needs are. Oftentimes we need to be thinking about what the child needs, what the student needs as we're designing our individualized education program. And even Cindy kind of said that too, we need to know our student deeply first, and these experiences may actually highlight new strengths in our understanding of them. And I'm seeing a couple questions coming in from the audience. Somebody asked about what twice exceptional meant, which is what I referred to before. This is an individual who might be gifted in one area but have an identified disability. And there's a question also from the audience, or a comment, individualized education is antiquated and frankly ableist because we never recognize this notion of interdependence as a life goal. I think one of the pieces here is that Ultimately, if we go back to that purpose of IDEA, our individualized education programs should be designed for what that purpose is, which is economic self-sufficiency of those individuals. It really takes us back to understanding that the purpose is beyond just what we're seeing in terms of the education today. I'm going to pause from answering some of those questions because I know we'll have a Q&A time at the end. And I really want us to reflect and think about this importance of individualization, especially as our speakers that are coming up are going to be communicating. You're going to hear a little bit about some assessment practices and different ways that we can support culturally and linguistically diverse learners who may or may not have disabilities. And I think that that's also critically important as we're thinking about this individualization piece. So if we move to the next slide, I encourage you to check out the Progress Center website. And I really want us to really reflect on those present level statements as we're thinking about how to, how we're thinking about services for students as we're reopening schools, and really think through this notion that we have to know the present levels in terms of their present circumstances. And that's kind of where I'm going to leave us today. I know I have one more disclaimer slide. We always have to add in our disclaimers for our center work, but really reflect on that present levels for present circumstances. And I think I'm going to turn it over to our next presenter. Thanks.
Okay, I think it's a perfect segue to get to my presentation. So if you can go to the slide already. Okay, thank you. So as Terry was talking about finding out the needs of the students, so clearly in order to do that, we need to do assessment. So I'm going to talk about what we need to pay attention to when trying to find out students' needs through assessment, especially English learners, and also how practitioners should consider when collaborating with their families. Next slide. So when we're preparing to return to schools in the fall, there's no question that many students may still be facing many different types of challenges. So issues about student emotion, anxiety, mental health, so on and so forth. And there's no question that schools will need to do assessment to determine how much language and learning loss students have regressed. So what changes should they make then when they're thinking about students' IEP? And then also how instructions will need to be changed. All these will have to be rely on data. So regarding assessment, instead of just doing what we always do, we may need to rethink the process, especially when assessing English learners. Next slide. So I'm sure probably all of you are familiar with this portion of the IDEA 2004 about assessing students. It said that when assessing students, we cannot rely on only one tool to make decision. And also the tools will need to be technically sound. That means it has to be research. So it's not just any test that we want to use. Next slide. So when we choose a test, we must ensure that it's not racially or culturally biased. So for English learners, we must first evaluate them in their native language and English, so we can consider that information during our formal testing. So practitioners need to be aware that not all English learners are bilingual. So do not automatically assume that because they are English learners, you must assess the child in their primary language or their native language. Some English learners don't really have a primary language. What I meant is that many English learners have been educated in English very early on US schools and have received little to no formal academic instructions in their primary language. So the team must first determine the strengths and weaknesses of their primary language, and then the strengths and weaknesses of their English before formal testing can take place. So they can determine during testing which part of the testing may need to be using their native language versus which part of the testing may need to be using English. Next slide. So I'm going to share some tips and strategies when assessing English learners. So keep in mind that what I share with you are not just based on my opinions, it's actually based on what research has already said. Next slide. So when you're ready to test the students, it's crucial that only trained bilingual examiners are used. So keep in mind, it's not just bilingual assessors, but trained bilingual assessors. That means they will know how to do the test, but also know how to make interpretation when they receive data. Next slide. So as mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, students will need some time to transition back to their regular school routine and expectations. So they need to be adjusted back in person learning. Therefore, it's important that the team does not rely heavily on just standardized tests. Instead, more informal assessments may be needed in part of the assessment plan. Next. Not all school districts are fortunate to have trained bilingual examiners. So, or the school may need to assess a child with a very rare language, and not that many specialists or practitioners are linguistically diverse. So schools are actually recommended to use nonverbal tests and interpreters in testing. Next. So when using interpreters in testings, schools must use only trained interpreters. When I said trained, I meant more than just being fluent in English and the target language. They should have basic knowledge of special education policies and processes and what testing process in special education is involved. So the team must inform them the roles and responsibilities in testing. If we must use an interpreter in testing, clearly that means the examiner doesn't speak the child's language. So how do you know what the interpreter said during testing? So it's crucial that to inform interpreters, their role is to interpret. They should only interpret what the test question said, what the student said, and should not really just record record the student's response as they are, rather than based on their opinion. So this needs to be very clear. You want to ensure that the interpreters you use are reliable and committed. So when we test students, we often need to coordinate with their classroom teacher and pull them out. So they may be available during a specific time frame. If the interpreter comes late or leave early, that can be problematic. Additionally, when scheduling for an interpreter, you may want to reserve them at least 30 minutes earlier than the actual test time, and maybe 30 minutes a little bit longer than the actual test session. So having them come early will enable the examiner and the interpreter to touch on any last-minute issues or changes in the test sessions that they need to be prepared. The 30 minutes after can also be the buffer time, in case the session runs longer than it should, and allow examiner to debrief with the interpreter. Next. So information about the test you plan to use should be shared with the interpreter ahead of time, not just on the day of the testing. So just like you and me, when we have to administer a new test, we need time to review the materials. This is the same as the interpreters. They may want to add some notes or things to remind themselves what to do, and also what are some of the things that they should not do. So it's important that this information is conveyed to them ahead of time. Next slide. So since they need time to review the test, no question, they should be given access to the test materials, right? That means give them a copy so that they can review the materials ahead of time before the test sessions. Next. Any information that you have about the students should also be shared with the interpreters. For example, if the student you plan to test stutters or may appear that they are pausing in between, you may need to let the interpreters know that this is the way how they actually communicate. So do not interrupt. May want to wait a little bit longer and confirm that the student has finished responding before asking the following questions. Next. Encourage the interpreters to take written notes during testing. You may think that it's silly, but actually it's not. So throughout the years that I've worked with interpreters, a lot of them, they don't take notes and they just do it whatever they remember. So do encourage them to take notes. And also, for example, if you encounter any issues during testing, encourage them that they shouldn't have a conversation with the examiner during that time. Instead, they may want to write down the questions and speak with the examiner later. And examiners are encouraged to record the sessions. Some prefer that, some don't. That's up to you. But if you do record, it can be beneficial, especially if you notice something during testing. You can always refer back to the recording during your debrief time with the interpreter and clarify some of the issues that you may have. And keep in mind that all these is actually helping you to interpret and analyze the data, because you're relying on the interpreters to give you all the information. So it's important to clarify any confusion. Next. Examiners and interpreters must practice ahead of time before their first testing session. This way, the interpreter can be prepared ahead of time and then notice that what are some of the issues that they should pay attention to. Next. So by now, you should have heard me say several times about debrief. Debrief is crucial and should occur right after each test session. So that's why I asked you to reserve the interpreter a little bit longer than they should. So the examiner and the interpreter can discuss any issues they encounter during the session, especially if you're going to use the interpreter for the second part or the third part of the test sessions. It's important to address those issues early on so that it doesn't keep accumulating throughout the entire test sessions. So address them before the next session you're going to have. Next. So often practitioners have difficulty determining the differences between language differences and language and disabilities. So I want to use this opportunity to share 2 examples with you. So next. So for example, when you think about during listening, listening to English learners speak, you notice that the students may have some delay in responding to your questions. When it's a language issue, sometimes keep in mind that students may actually be taking their time to translate the questions from one language to English before responding, which leads to the delay. However, as English learners be exposed to English more, then this lab time should actually gradually improve so that the time will be shortened. However, if the English learners actually delay in responding questions, no matter it's presented in their primary language or English, then it doesn't get improved over time. This may be an issue that practitioners may need to investigate. It could be a disability issue. Next slide. This is another example about during reading. So when students don't understand what they're reading, if it's a language issue, they may actually lack some background knowledge in English, or also doing some translation process, during that time, which may actually cause confusion, since not all languages can easily translate from one to another. However, if students actually struggle in reading in their primary language or English, depending on which language is used as the core instruction, then they don't improve over time, then that could be a disability issue that we need to investigate too. So to determine language differences versus disability, it is a complicated process and takes time and takes a lot of data collection. So keep in mind that a lot of variables such as age and amount of time being exposed to English can also affect how fast and how slow they acquire the language. And thinking about during the pandemic is almost a year and a half that English learners are suddenly back into full-time maybe in their primary language. So sometimes maybe the regression occurs rather than is something they're not learning. So practitioners need to pay attention during the testing process. Next. So since the pandemic, I think Sasha mentioned already, all of us can see that the importance of family engagement. Without the help of families, there's no way that remote learning could take place last year. So for students with disabilities, families also suddenly take on additional roles as specialists when in-person therapy was unable to be provided. So we need to think about is family actually has a lot to contribute. So when we think about families, they need to be a part of your data collection process. Parents know a lot more than practitioners think, especially what happened last school year, because they are full-time with their children. They know what they were doing, what they were struggling. So there's a lot that they can actually share with the school. So do not simply rely on your testing data when students return in the fall. Parents can actually provide you with much more information than you think, since they were the ones provided directed support and instruction to their children. Next. So families need to be informed of the entire process, assessment process, IEP process, even thinking about, pre-referral or referral process too. So starting in the fall, schools will need to evaluate the students and determine what skills they have regressed. So parents should be allowed to be involved in this entire process. They should also be informed of the entire process. And keep in mind that when we think about inform, that's actually just one-way communication. So we don't want, informing is good, you're giving information to parents, but informing just one-way communication is not sufficient. Next slide. So when we think about to communicate with parents, we need to have two-way communications, right? Two-way communications means both parties are involved in that discussion rather than just being informed. So to communicate with parents who have low English proficiency level, interpreters and translators would definitely be used. Schools should only use ones that have been trained. So existing research has consistently shown that when untrained interpreters and translators are used, they may actually do more harm than good in the process. So keep in mind that when individuals can speak two languages, do not automatically qualify them to be interpreters and translators in the field. So they need to have some basic special education knowledge in order for them to do quality interpretations and translations. And even for translators, when translators translate written messages, they need to consider the comprehension level of the parents too. So it is an important thing that practitioners think about is any written documents, including the IEP, needs to be written at 5th grade readability level. And in my previous studies, we actually found that a lot of IEPs are written at high school to college levels. So imagine the confusion the translators may have, especially when they're not trained. And a lot of jargons and acronyms were used in these documents that confuse the translators because they're not trained, they're not familiar with the glossary. And when they just make up their translation or use whatever they understand, that actually confuses parents more. And think about IEP is legal document, so you want to make sure the information is being translated correctly. Okay, next. So finally, parents also need to be trained. So giving the information is good, communicating that with them is good, but parents also need to be trained. Not all parents know how to work with their children with disabilities. So during the pandemic, many research has actually published already and indicated that families, especially those who are from low SES and diverse backgrounds, they struggle to support their children with disabilities during remote learning because they don't know how to help them. Even when students are back to in-person learning, parents do work with them at home. So they should be trained how to work with their children. So think about, for example, if the speech pathologist teaches the student with disability sign language, because they're nonverbal or whatever reason, what's being taught should also be shared with parents and also teach the parents how to use those same sign languages that the child has already learned from school to communicate. So they can actually use the consistent strategies or method to work with them and also communicate with them. And throughout this consistent process, the ones who benefit from this collaborative partnership are actually our students. So that's it from my portion of the presentation. Thanks for your attention.
Hi, everyone. And I would like to thank Sasha, Terry, and Lusa. They have really touched on a lot of things that I will be alluding to in my section of presentation. But mine specifically has to do with supporting culturally and linguistically diverse students through the MTSS post-pandemic and beyond. Next slide, please. So what we know is that multi-tiered systems of support, when implemented with fidelity, does work. Actually, it does work for a group, a large section of students in remediating their academic and behavioral issues. But also what research tells us is for a portion of the students, and specifically speaking about students of color, MTSS has not been successful in remediating both academic and behavioral issues. For example, and when we look at Black students specifically, we know that even within MTSS, they have been overrepresented in office disciplinary referrals. And when we look at students, Hispanic students and Black students and also Indigenous students, we know that academically they have not fared on very well. But those are important things that we know from research. But one additional aspect of this that educators should consider as we go back into looking at students from culturally and linguistically diverse background is looking at factors beyond efficacy of MTSS that contribute to issues of inequity that largely impact students from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds that, and in essence, contributing to those gaps in academic achievement for these students. Next slide, please. So the previous speakers have touched on a lot of the disparities that were exposed during COVID-19. So I will be browsing through this, but my focus on this specific slide is just kind of reviewing the impact exposed by COVID for families from low socioeconomic backgrounds. And Sasha really did a good job in explaining what they were going through. So for teachers and practitioners who work with students from low socioeconomic status, this is teachers in those inner city school and Title I schools. This is not new information to these teachers, but the pandemic really exposed these disparities. And examples of families from this background having to do more than one job, having issues with housing, food insecurity, all factors that are really critical in the well-being of any student. So we know that when a family has to work more than one job, that impacts their availability to work with the home, with the child at home. And things like homework, the students will not be able to receive support. Housing, which leads to homelessness for families. And when I talk about homelessness, I'm not talking just in the sense of families living in shelters or families finding themselves on the streets, but talking about specifically families that have to move in with other members of families, and that does impact that space in which they can support their children to be successful. And we all know as educators that work with the students from low socioeconomic backgrounds, is food insecurity is a big thing. And we know that pure nutrition contributes to poor academic outcomes, school outcomes for the students. The issue of financial stress, okay, yes, thanks. The issue of financial distress is a big one for these families. They have to pick and choose what they focus on with the little money that they have. And so we find that these families struggle with the basic issues of internet and the equipment they need to complete assignments. And this was very evident, as Sasha talked about. They had to provide the computers to their families, and they have to then teach these families how to use those computers. Those are all factors that are compounding and make issues, the issue of disparities, very large. And another important thing when we're thinking about older students, this one is high school and beyond from grade 9, we find that because of the financial distress, some of those students have to work and contribute to the financial needs of the family. And thinking about COVID-19 and working from home, students having to attend school from home, we know that it was an opportunity for a lot of students coming from socioeconomic status to contribute to the families. And this meant that they had to essentially miss class time by necessity so that they can contribute to the well-being of the families. And so those gaps that have been widened because of that, students not being able to attend class adequately. And this was actually spoken about by the previous speakers. So another one point that really exposed is limited communication with schools. Again, as I can say, Sasha pointed to this, with the families that don't have enough money and having to prioritize one month they might be able to afford having a cell phone for communication, and maybe having internet access. The next month they don't have that, and schools are limited in the ways they can get contact with these families. And all those factors, when we consider them, they impact in the way this general and overall school outcomes for students who come from low socioeconomic status. Next slide, please. And so why is this important when we're talking about low socioeconomic status? I'll just share this example, which is just one aspect of literacy. And research has shown that there is at least a 500 vocabulary gap between students from low socioeconomic status and those ones from professional families at age 3. And so we're thinking about age 3 as the age in which students are starting to enter school. So already students from low socioeconomic status, they come in at a disadvantage. And those gaps are important for educators to note, especially knowing where the backgrounds of your students. Next slide, please. So then how does this relate to students from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds? As you can see from this data, is that children from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds are largely impacted by poverty. A lot of them, and this data goes back from 2010 until 2019, as you can note from the graph, consistently students, American Indian students, Black students, and Hispanic students constantly experience poverty on a larger basis as compared to Asian and Pacific Island students and white students. And thinking about the COVID-19 and its impact, we know that a lot of students from these similar backgrounds were largely impacted. When we look at data for homelessness, home evictions, job loss, and the students' families from these similar demographics were impacted largely as compared again to families from white non-Hispanic backgrounds. And this is important that educators, and as we open the schools and go back, that educators note that our
So while we're waiting for Robai to get her sound back, hopefully she'll be able to join us and finish up her presentation in just a few minutes. What I would like to do is let's just kind of go right into some of the questions that came in. And what we can, what I would like to do is there's sort of a theme of a question that I've heard from in several that came through. And that's sort of talking about the, maybe some of the things that schools did, or maybe even families put in place during the pandemic that were necessary to kind of get through those times. But as they're going forward into coming back in re-entering and reopening schools, they might have sort of a negative consequence. Like one of the examples was that in order to provide some safety for certain students with disabilities or especially with the health impairment, they may have been put into a certain cohort. So kind of that bubble idea, I think, that they could then, sort of contain the exposure. But now the concern would be is that is going to become a default LRE. So I don't know if any of the panelists would want to sort of weigh in a little bit on that question. Oh, do we have Robai?
Yes, I'm back.
So why don't we hold that question and give Robai, you can finish up your presentation, and then we'll come back to that question.
All right. Okay, I apologize, everyone. Let me see. So, okay, I think this is where we are. So I'm not sure how much of this slide everybody listened to before I disappeared, but just going back to the importance of why focus on students from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds and the issue of poverty. We know that from data that students from American Indian background, Black students and Hispanic students experience poverty at higher levels than any other student. And this has been consistent, data indicates, although for Hispanic students looks like the percentage was trending downward by 2019, but we know based of the impact of COVID-19 that the similar groups were impacted highly than the other two groups that we are looking at. So Hispanic families, Black families, American Indian families, COVID-19 had very harsh impact on them. The issue of homelessness impacting this group of families more than any other person. The issues of losing jobs and having to move or live with relatives was highly impacting these three groups again. So in thinking about opening and going back this coming year, we have, as educators, we have to consider that this group of students, they might be highly impacted by the issue of poverty, which then translates to those challenges that I shared in the previous a background that impact the students' learning. Next slide, please. So what does this mean for tiered support? So we know our response to intervention or the multi-tiered systems of support. And tier one is where everything that I have discussed comes in critical in trying to look at beyond what tier one typically offers. So when we think about tier one, I know Terry talked about this, and I know Sasha talked briefly about tiered supports. Beyond Fidelity, all the educators implementing everything with Fidelity, we have to also consider what is offered as a tier one. And typically at tier one, everything is universal. Universal curriculum is usually given at tier one. Universal screening at tier one. Progress monitoring is done universally at tier one. Well, at this level at tier one, this is with the assumption that every student is on the same level. But for students who are from low socioeconomic status and students who are culturally and linguistically diverse, who are, again, largely impacted by poverty, the universal at tier one might not be enough. So what that means is teachers and all practitioners working with these groups in the general education classroom might need to go beyond what is typically and traditionally offered at Tier 1. There might be a need for a supplemental curriculum beyond what is used at Tier 1 to help alleviate or close the gaps that are presented by these students when they are coming back. There might be a need for supplemental assessments beyond the assessments given at Tier 1. And finally, there might be a need for frequent progress monitoring for these students to make sure that those gaps are realized and the needs are quickly identified, diagnosed, and addressed before they lead into wider gaps that then may necessitate Tier 2 support. So that is one thing that I would like to offer as implications, especially for Tier 1, because if Tier 1 supports are not comprehensive or increased for this group of students, then by default, we are going to send them a Tier 2, and we know that that will perpetuate that achievement gap between those students of color and other students that we experience within even the multi-tiered systems of support. Next slide, please. So for this slide, I'll just share the first 3 points. Will just go through real fast, but I'll emphasize the last one of building relationships as relates to students from low socioeconomic status and by default students from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. So activating and honoring students' prior knowledge, really key, making learning contextual, so relevant to what the learner knows. It's really key to sustain the interest and motivation for the students to learn. Acknowledging the cultural capital is also important, and really what the students bring on plate. And obviously it's not a blank slate. Students have experiences, they have cultural experiences that they can contribute, which educators can leverage to build on and create an upward trajectory for their success, both academically and behaviorally. But also considering your classroom setup, and I know many can just consider this simply as good teaching, but thinking about your class, your space, whichever space you find yourself in, and how that space is arranged in a way that it gives access to learning of all students. And in this particular situation, we are talking about students from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, and also students experiencing the low socioeconomic issues that I have discussed in the background. But I know building relationships, it's more, and I would like to emphasize that, and I would end on that for my presentation. Everybody that talked before me, they were talking about family involvement, engaging families. But so relationships with students, but also with families is really critical. And we know from doing working closely with these families, especially families who are coming from low socioeconomic status and experiencing those issues that come along with that many of these families are not readily willing to share these issues with them because of fear or whatever reasons, but they might have fears of negative impact of sharing, for example, that they're homeless. If they say that they're not, they're homeless, then there's the fear of losing their children or whatever it is. So all those factors come into play, and these families are not that readily willing to really share these things, but what it takes is those connections and relationships that educators can make with those families, getting to earn the trust of these families and confidence that they are willing to reach out, because many schools, and Sasha alluded to some of these, where they were going, providing food, going into homes and providing the things that the families need. It's not that schools might be able to provide everything, but schools might have connections and resources that they can direct the families to alleviate some of those extreme impact that the issues of homelessness and poverty impact so that the child can then focus on the academics rather than being focused on those other factors that impact their learning. And I would just end with that, saying it's really critical that those relationships are formed that would help then educators to be able to immediately identify the challenges that families are experiencing and in providing the supports they need, so that then they can give the academic and social emotional support for the students to advance academically. Thank you. I'll just give them to the next person.
Okay. So thank you. What a great panel. We have just a few minutes before the end, but I would like you all to have an opportunity to talk about that question that came in. What exactly are your thoughts about some of the strategies that have been put in place during the pandemic that could be carried over and not have good impact as schools are reopening? And just to get this started, Terry, how about if I put you on the spot, and then maybe Sasha, I'll have you also answer this one.
Great, thanks, David. I think we've heard a theme throughout that one of the practices that we want to make sure that we're carrying through and carrying forward is that parental and family involvement piece. I know as just somebody who's very touched personally by disability, and within, my stepson has a disability, that parent and family communication is critical. It helps us to understand, again, going back to kind of what I was talking about, those present level statements. And so, we really want to be making sure that we're bringing them into play. I also think that, MTSS is our grounding framework. We've heard that throughout this presentation. And so we need to re-envision what really is core, what really is tier 1 instruction. And so as Robai just eloquently mentioned, that has to include culturally and linguistically diverse practices. We also need to be thinking about universal design for learning within that core instruction, what we need to be doing for all learners that takes into consideration the needs of some. And then as we intensify our supports, we should also be thinking about in terms of, and I saw a question kind of coming from the audience around this, but we don't want to just jump forward. And I think Sasha touched on this a little bit in her presentation too. We don't just want to jump forward and think about, everything that we need to do for remediation. We have to be thinking about how our standards are really articulating across the grade levels. And so really focusing on those individual sorts of strategies, our accelerated learning practices, where we're providing just-in-time supports for youth. And so I think that those are some of the things that we can kind of move forward with and just make sure that we are putting those protective factors in place. We know that instruction is a protective factor for our learners. So I think Sasha was going to tackle this one next as well.
Yeah, sure. I saw that comment come in as well. I talked a little bit about how, I'm assuming because of ease of giving students with special needs the services that they needed in a remote environment. I think that lots of kids were grouped together into homogeneous groupings, which is not the least restricted environment for many students. That's not what happened at my school, so I can't actually say exactly, what the reasonings were, but I can assume that is why, along with the health as well. But Terry, like you said, this is a year of collaborating with parents who are their students or our students' first teachers, right? So what they have to say, we need to listen to and we need to really value. So we just need to go back again to the vision of the school year and the vision of each of our students. Like, do we want our kids to be in a small group in a homogeneous settings where they're not exposed to all of what school has to offer? If that is not the least restricted environment for the students, then we need to go back, reevaluate, and rethink the student's plan. So
I know that we are at time. I'm going to just take some liberty and just ask another question, because I think that there's another theme that's in the questions that have come in from the audience, and that has to do with the staff capacity. So planning time in terms of study halls for students, just some of those pieces of UDL and of instruction and of assessment, and how to pull all of these pieces together as schools are reopening. And I just wonder whether or not, let's start with you, Luz, and then Robai, if you want to sort of tackle those, and then, what are your thoughts about that? And we can't hear you. I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So thinking about staff support and time is definitely needed. I mean, there's no question. But clearly the situation is how the administrators actually make arrangement so that whatever is needed, can be done. I also see a question about having additional tutors or study halls, or for assessment after school or something like that. All these can be arranged. Keep in mind that we're not bounded by just the school time from 8 to whatever. That's instructional time. But thinking about if meetings with parents, can definitely occur before and after school. Of course, depending on whether the staffs are willing or not. And then same thing if support is needed. Just like IEP, Terry talked about individualized, right? A couple times already. It's the needs. The needs need to match with the support. Of course, to determine the needs, the data need to reflect the needs, right? So if the needs shows the support that the children need, then schools will need to provide that. It's a legal contract. I mentioned that before, and all of us know that. So if somehow these kind of support need to occur at home, or support needs to occur after school, like for extended school time or additional time right after school for some parents, like opt out for extended school year or so on and so forth. Definitely, it's the team needs to have that discussion, right? Clearly not just the parent want it or just the school wants it. Has to be a team. The team means including the school, the professionals, and the families. So as long as the team agrees on that, then that can happen. Arrangement just need to be made. So it will not be bounded by just the school hours. And clearly there might be limited resources, but schools will, I know that there are a lot, there's some CARES fund, from federal government going into school to transition back to the fall. So schools will need to share with the federal government, how those funds are being used too. So hopefully, if there are parents in the audience, they will give feedback to the schools too, what is needed. And if teachers are in the audience, then hopefully they will give feedback to the administrators about what are some of the specific supports and needs are required, so that they can actually determine how the funding is being distributed.
Okay. I think did you all need me to comment? Yes, I think yes. I was getting, yes. So when the issue of capacity is really, it's a real concern, actually. And as a former special education classroom teacher, it is something that I grappled with and struggled with, where, yes, the IEP articulates one thing, that amount of the time that the child should receive specific services, but then as a special education teacher, then you're faced, especially when there's a shortage of special education teachers or service providers, you're faced with the issue of how individualized that support is when you have your caseload. So obviously, I can't say I have a direct answer on how that can be handled, but thinking about the MTSS at Tier 1 supports, I think training is really critical for especially general education teachers. If the general education teachers can receive training on how to individualize and support students with disabilities, especially those ones receiving support in the general education setting, then that will go a long way in providing some of those supports, especially I know that Terry mentioned UDL practices. UDL practices, within UDL practices, differentiation can occur, especially for those students that need differentiated materials within UTR for them to be able to access and demonstrate what they have learned within the classroom. So what I would say is expanding the training and the knowledge so that within the team, not just one person has that expertise for the specialized instruction would go a long way in helping address some of those issues. That could include the parents too. And again, that has been the theme in having parents trained so that they know how to work with students. I can't tell you how many times I interacted with parents who actually were reaching out to me to help them with strategies on how to work with their child at home because they didn't know how to do that. So that parental education is critical. Training other educators and other personnel within the school so that it's not only one person within the team that has expertise on individualized supports would be helpful in this case.
Well, and that I think is going to have to be our last thought of the day because we are already about 7 minutes over. If you would go to the slide deck and just go to the last slide, because that is, first of all, as we're doing that, I want to just thank the panelists because you were just superb and very thought-provoking. And I apologize to the audience because there were a number of really great questions that did come in, but we just don't have time to answer all of those. But I do believe that there are some informal times later in the conference that you can have some of these conversations about things. So we encourage you to do that. But I want to end with just a disclaimer again to remind folks that these this presentation does not necessarily represent the thoughts of the department, the policy of the department, or endorsement by the federal government. And so again, thank you to Sasha, Lusa, Terry, and Robai for a great session today.